In his 1941 State of the Union address, then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt set out a lofty goal for American manufacturing. As the U.S. inched perilously closer to entering the Second World War, he demanded of American factories 10,000 new military aircraft by the time he reached the next annual address. He was laughed at in national and international papers. 10,000 airplanes at the time was about the size of the aircraft force at large of Britain and Germany, and so producing that much in a year, even for a burgeoning industrial giant like the United States, seemed pretty laughable. In the end, of course, it was Roosevelt who got the last laugh, as by the next year, U.S. factories were close to producing 100,000 military aircraft per year. This, obviously, is a good annal for the arsenal of democracy motif that runs through World War II and helped the Democratic Allies overcome the perils of fascism in the 40s. But it's also a good example of a trend of presidents setting out goals that seem lofty at the time, but in the end up helping the world, and a rather optimistic parable for the United States' ability to aid the world in its time of need. Perhaps no goal was more lofty than when President Obama and a variety of advisors in 2009 helped sign the Paris Climate Accords, indeed helped push it and set it up, with nearly 200 nations joining the vital climate treaty that promised to cut emissions in half by 2030 and aim for a carbon-neutral society by the middle of the century to combat the extreme, almost world-threatening effects of global climate change. Obviously, in 2017, then-President Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord to much hubbub and uproar from environmental activists, and recently, just in April, now President Joe Biden rejoined the accord, to which many were asking, what is the significance of all of this political squabbling? Will the US rejoining the Paris Climate Accord really make that much of a tangible difference in the climate effort? And the answer is, again, although it may sound optimistic, emphatically yes. By setting aggressive emission goals and returning to a position of global leadership, not just on climate, but in a variety of areas, the US's resurgence in the climate fight is a vital step in helping to stop and abet global warming. This is for three main reasons. First, the US produces the most emissions of any country on the globe. Even without the added benefits of international cooperation and global leadership, cutting that in half is a significant step towards helping with global warming. Second, rejoining opens the door for renewal in global funding from the US to other various environmental efforts, not necessarily only domestic goals. And third, this signals American re-engagement in the international sphere, not just in climate but in other areas, which is a vital part of global unity in this fight. But first, the US produces the most emissions of any country in most years, according to the BBC on April 22nd. Quote, the US is the traditional leader in global emissions in nearly all areas, particularly greenhouse gases. It's true that this does fluctuate year to year. China, in particular, has been pumping out an excess of emissions in the last decade, but the trend generally follows that the US produces the most emissions in the world. So even regardless of a treaty or international cooperation, the US re-engaging and setting goals to cut our own emissions is highly important in the climate fight, considerably more important than cutting emissions in places like Poland and Indonesia, where there's simply less of them. The Washington Post in 2017, when Donald Trump pulled out, said, quote, the U.S. is more numerically significant to the Accords than any other single country. And that's entirely true. Even the EU doesn't produce nearly as many emissions per year as the U.S. does, and the carbon per tons in the U.S. exceeds any other country over the past 100 years exponentially. Which means that cutting emissions in the United States is vital, regardless of international cooperation, and marks a significant step in helping with climate change. The numerics of the United States make it a more significant piece of the puzzle than any other country, and so resetting climate emission goals, particularly aggressive ones like President Biden has promised, is a significant step in aiding global warming. But second, rejoining also opens the other global environmental efforts to the floodgate of U.S. funding that they became accustomed to before Donald Trump pulled out of the Accords. The Paris Accords is very complicated, but it's very important to understand that it doesn't stand alone. It's part of an interlocking series of international commitments and treaties to helping with the environment that Donald Trump largely disengaged from, even if not directly. Vox on April 21st reports, quote, Paris isn't just about Paris. Biden is interested in, quote, dozens of other projects, according to aides close to him. That's highly important. U.S. funding is, again, a huge source of the help in the fight against global emissions and global warming, and so sending that money to other places, even if they don't have as direct or flashy an impact as Paris, is really important, from replanting trees in the Amazon to watering drought-hit areas in Central Africa. US funding is a powerful force, and by re-engaging with the Paris Climate Accords, it signals that Biden is ready to re-engage with the environmental fight at large. And that's highly important to the continuation of the fight, as US words and US dollars are highly important in supporting the international legitimacy and effectiveness of this fight. Third, and perhaps most importantly, this signals American re-engagement in the international sphere, a vital part of global unity on climate change. Like it or not, America is still the world's only standing superpower, and as the New York Times on April 22nd reports, quote, "The US is back in the fight as global climate efforts regain potence." That's entirely true, for the two reasons I discussed above, and for the simple reason that American support lends legitimacy to any international effort. The US rejoining the Paris Accords lends legitimacy to the fight against global climate change, as if it needed it. And the US re-engaging in a more progressive stance on climate is incredibly vital in offering support and offering moral re-engagement and unity to the people surrounding the climate fight. Forbes on April 19th reports something similar. Quote, "US leadership on climate is more important than you might think." Populations globally are feeling the brunt of climate change, lashed by hurricanes, pounded by droughts, and flooded out of their homes. This is only going to get more frequent and worse. The US has the power to help, and by re-engaging with the Paris Accords, it is doing that in three main ways. First, the US produces the most emissions. Cutting that in half is numerically significant, regardless of international sympathy. Second, rejoining opens the door to a floodgate of US funding towards other global international and environmental efforts. And third, this signals American re-engagement on the global scale, a vital part of helping our global unity towards climate change. Because good government and good faith can change the world, even if just in a single country. 10,000 airplanes at a time.